Good morning to everyone. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. It's good to see you all. Just one second. Sorry, it's good to see you all. Okay, I'd like to start to say that, as we all know, we live in a world of fragile things, fragile selves, and fragile environments. Psychotherapy has come to claim a unique place in contemporary culture. It is one of the few places that one can listen to the subject of the unconscious, the subject of suffering, fragility, failure, but also of humor and creativity. So if we can say that psychotherapy is a qualitative inquiry into human subjectivity, then the very area that we are exploring is human experience. However, one difficulty I will pose straight away is that psychology and psychotherapy, not as a profession, but as a discourse, has reached a point in popular culture where the representations of these experiences have almost become commodified. You can be healed, changed, sorted out for the exchange of any amount of money in the shortest time possible. So perhaps one of the greatest challenges facing psychotherapy is to situate its discourse so it can occupy another space. We know it's a clinical space, a professional space, but it's also a relational space where its deep subversion and the invitation to a whole ambiguity of encounter can yield radical truth at the heart of this important encounter between a psychotherapist and a person presenting for help. So what are the challenges for psychotherapy as a profession and as an activity in these modern times? Of course, we're in Vienna, and some say psychotherapy as an event in history is the interesting speculations of a man in Vienna at the turn of the last century. Others say that psychotherapy is now of its time. Why? In a world where the illusion of everything being available to whoever needs it, psychotherapy offers us some explanatory frameworks to its underlying theory of the complexities and dynamics of human desire that shape our understandings of self and others. Psychotherapy is both a meeting and an inquiry into human subjectivity, points to certain principles that go some way to understanding the ambivalence that is at the heart of human struggle. So I'll move on to say a few more words about psychotherapy in contemporary life, and then I would like to explore more comprehensively the challenges and opportunities regarding the training of psychotherapists for a changing world. So as we know, throughout our societies, there's a loss of social cohesion, there's rising levels of anxiety, displaced populations, and increasing complex ideologies, leading to, we could say, leading to deficits in democratic accountability. There's a lack of trust in the institutions that used to organize stability, or at least a semblance of it. There's a limited distinction between what recognize as truth and what some recognize as lies, and some don't know what to think. But increasingly, the challenge of who is the other is becoming one of the greatest challenges in our societies, leading to waves of nationalism, entitlement ideologies, and values based on economic necessity rather than human values. We even know as societies we have a broken response to immigration. There are complex tribal wars and cultural wars between tribalism and globalism. There are new configurations in our social and cultural lives about how we belong. This in turn is leading to what some sociologists called a fluid modernity. And what they mean by this is that everything is fluid and can take on the shape of any ideology that can hold it. In 2014, at a conference in Portoroz, Slovenia. Marcus Fay, a very good colleague and a Swiss psychoanalyst, said that postmodernism, globalism, and acceleration are three major cultural developments within which people live today. In cultures both in the West and in the East, the loss of privacy under capitalism has resulted almost in a shattering of social bonds, which worldwide is creating dislocation and fragmentation. These themes and discussions, which strike at the core of contemporary life, I am sure will be part of the discussions at this conference today. But let's come back to psychotherapy. Within all these contexts, we have to ask, what are the challenges facing psychotherapy as a practice and as a profession in modern life? Of course, this points us towards the identity of psychotherapists, particularly within a postmodern globalized context. Like, for example, and I'm sure you've seen it in your own practices, what are the contemporary dilemmas and presenting issues emerging in our clinical practices? How can psychotherapy as a practice familiarize itself with newer forms of emotional distress? Perhaps they're not newer, perhaps they're just presented in a different way. More and more people who come to us are suffering from broken attachments, fragmented states, and borderline presentations. It is almost as if the inner jagged states of distress are amplified by the multifaceted mirroring in the external world. Let's talk about the unconscious. Is the unconscious different in contemporary culture? No, the unconscious is always the unconscious. It might be expressed differently, but we are always addressing inner psyche with different emphasis, dependent on our early attachment history, the foundational desires of belonging, intimacy, power, significance, and perhaps transcendence, and our relationship to them. How these needs are shaped or distorted in the narrative of a person's life is what is presented to us. So how do we position ourselves as a profession so that the relevance of psychological processes might become a creative part of the wider social and political discourse in modern life? One way we have done this, I'm not sure successfully or not, but I think successfully, as a profession over the last 30 years, we have gathered together over 120,000 psychotherapists from 40 different countries and different approaches. And it is the accumulation of all of this work, all of this dialogue, all of this struggling together that we celebrate our achievements in the training, social and political fields. And we celebrate all of this today at our 30th anniversary conference. Before I move on to the question concerning the training of psychotherapists, I would like to say a few words here about the possible denigration of subjectivity in our cultures. We live with a paradox in that popular culture has become almost more emotionalized. However, there's a denigration of subjectivity, leading to, for example, a confusion between online and offline identities, an increase of what Susie Orbach, our colleague in UK, calls body hatred. That phenomenon is further evidenced by a rise in presentations of body dysmorphia in young adults and an increase in anorexia presenting in children at a young age. And I'm sure you can think of many other examples. We're all part of communications and social field, which has become part of our lives. It has enabled us here today to be able to talk across countries and across borders. And we know that we avail of innovative education platforms that facilitate great access to education and gives us a glimpse into other cultures and experiences of everyday living. All of these are progressive developments. Yet we need to inquire into the devolutionary pull within social media and cyberspace towards regression, the multiple identities assumed by people in their desire for intimacy, the demand sometimes for free speech, and what does free speech mean in this context, across the airways, offering disinhibited and sometimes vitriolic comment, and the ever-growing divide amplified between the public and the private. The point I'm making here is that the therapist's identity is formed in these cultural contexts, where on one hand we have the denigration of subjectivity, and the other, the emergence of many competing subjectivities. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to living a fulfilled life is to confront realities that cause us the most psychological pain. If we continually collude in not addressing some of our social, cultural, and psychological assumptions, we risk heading towards futures that are uncertain. So it is important at this time of huge change that we develop and incubate the social and political relevance of psychotherapy concepts and ideas, so that we can challenge, maybe just one example, the neoliberal blindness of institutions and systems that subjugate human desire for productive capacities. However, and this is important, I think it's essential that psychotherapy, whilst mirroring the splits and tensions in its host society, become aware as a profession not to provide psychologistic solutions to complex societal dilemmas. We need to be aware of the context of distress at a social level, so that we do not ignore engagement with emerging political realities, and in particular, engagement with the emerging epistemologies in the neurosciences of knowledge. And just put in here, for example, where will we stand? We could have a whole conference on this with regard to the emerging field of artificial intelligence and consciousness. So let me say a few words about science just before I go fully into the training of psychotherapists. An important part in our training involves our relationship to science as a field of discovery. Science is essential to particularly enable us to have a perspective that enables us to hold our cherished assumptions and formulate hypotheses that can be tested and explored. Indeed, Peter Fonagy reminds us, in a changing world of education and training, we also have to face the reality of being able, within interdisciplinary discourse, to speak out not just the fervent truth we hold, but also to open ourselves with the same inquiring mind to the systemization of our results. In this sense, we can say that science invites us into a field of discovery that meets almost what now they're talking about as a biological drive deep in our brainstem, and that is the seeking drive. However, what can happen in research environments in the human sciences where everything is seen to be measurable or quantified, where there's a reliance on a narrow field of inquiry supported by a narrow view of scientific validation? We would hope that the research methods used to study psychotherapy should be relevant and applicable to the nature and scope of the practice of psychotherapy. But I'm also saying that students should be invited to more broader critical modes of inquiry, which take into account the participant, the participation in, and the politics and ethics of research. Let's remember, concepts are problem-solving devices. They are like instruments for organizing perceptions into logically consistent patterns called explanations. Ideas, on the other hand, evoke support and require a different level of awareness itself. And I'd like to say a word here about sometimes where universities, they can be driven by market forces and markers about the number and range of research indices. That can become an end in itself, where the increasing number of scientific publications lead to increasing numbers of research grants, and the overall context of the nature of inquiry that underpins the question posed in the research gets lost, driven as it is sometimes by market forces rather than the field of knowledge. In this, we could increasingly lose the focus of a university, of our institute as a place of learning. So let me move on to say something about learning and about the training of psychotherapists. So this brings us directly to the question of the training of psychotherapists. What kind of practitioners do we need? What qualities do we need to be a psychotherapist in these changing times? And I would like to include a caveat from the very esteemed psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion. He said, if you've got no stomach for anxiety, you're in the wrong profession. And I think we can all relate to that statement. So training is a mixture between theoretical courses and an apprenticeship, learning how to do something with people. Recently, during a conferring ceremony in a university, I heard a very distinguished speaker said that he would prefer to call it commencement rather than graduation, as it is only then that, he said, trainees can start to integrate the maps of what they now know and engage the territory of learning. The Latin root of the term graduation comes from the word gradus, which means pace or step. I then considered the words training and education. The term to train relates to the Latin root instructare, to instruct, teach skills. The word education comes from the Latin educatus. It's the past participle of educare, to rear, to educate, and to lead forth. So that idea of leading forth, what does that actually mean? It's a receptive capacity within the human spirit. And how do we cultivate that within our trainings? So in addressing the stages of the journey to become a psychotherapist, I would like to explore what seem two contradictory aims. One is to produce a skilled practitioner, and two, to produce a therapeutic sensibility, almost a radical positioning for a psychotherapist, where, as the Irish poet Seamus Heaney said, when somebody asked him the very difficult and profound question, but perhaps simple, he was asked, how does he write poetry? He replied that he listened in. He listened into himself. How do we encourage students to develop that capacity to listen in, to practice a quality of attention towards a person in distress? I would suggest perhaps it's about cultivating a different level of inquiry. Perhaps I would suggest it's about the cultivation of a receptive, imaginative capacity, which would be a reading and listening to the poets and writers, both past and present within our culture. Bion, later in his life, entertained the fantasy of compiling a poetry anthology expressly for psychoanalyst use and psychotherapist use, perhaps recognizing that the psychoanalyst, like the poet, is forever creating a language. And there's something bigger than this here for me too. In our culture, where everything is driven by immediacy, poetry and gazing at artifacts, either natural or artistic, evokes in us a transient space, a space where there's a practice of pause, not just a self-satisfied waiting, but sometimes a deep stirring of the edges of an idea, which can be tumultuous at its depths. Sometimes the gaps in our consciousness, both political and philosophical, can be received through the words of literature and the arts, in that they encourage us to receive and see with different eyes all that all that may have appeared familiar before. We cannot, however, be seduced into the allure of aesthetic spaces. We also, of course, need to balance that to develop an inquiring mind to deeply embed our theoretical models and the edges of the new area of research. So there's a challenge for trainees. The challenge for the trainee inwardly is between uncertainty and certainty, between linear logic and poetic knowing, between empirical data and metaphorical elegance. And they are all the symbolic context out of which the training of psychotherapists occur. So our new curriculum needed. What subject matters need to be a part of a psychotherapist training in these changing times? We have our theories, our knowledge and skill base. Perhaps we need to introduce other rich sources of models of mental life. I would suggest a few. I'm sure you have many others. I would suggest a broader vision rooted in ecological and sociological understanding, a listening to the poets, artists, and writers and what they have to say, a clear understanding of the nature of change, its chaos and its underlying order, a clear rooting of all training in philosophy, an exploration of new perspectives in the fields of neurobiology, affective neuroscience, and all that we know in relation to the body. And finally, and probably very apt at this moment in time, a deep study of history, memory, and the psychosocial forces that shape cultures. And of course, how do we train psychotherapists to understand that even our experience and understanding of different emotional states is bound up with culture? The concept of self in Western cultures can be very different to that used in other cultures. Do we develop culturally sensitive mental health services? How do we embed deeply diversity frameworks within our trainings? And after training, how do we encourage, someone not just to fill in a CPD form and count up hours? How do we encourage the coming about of a situation that after a person trains, they include within their ongoing formation as a practitioner, a fostering of an inner fire, so that the commitment to their continuing professional development is out of a continuing curiosity. The quiet moments that we all have in our consulting rooms, where we wonder about a word unsaid, a mood, an atmosphere. This requires an active inquiring mind, shaped and questioned by what is happening within ourselves, what is coming to life within ourselves, as well as the newer developments in research and ethical practice. But essentially, I'm talking about the development of the cultivation of an indwelling active presence. It's almost, I'm saying here, we have to slow down to become a psychotherapist. And of course, this is a process of engaging in a reflective, critical discourse on the nature of the human, subject. I'd like to come towards an end. I'm just mindful of time. I'm saying that there is a distinction between learning and knowledge. And there's an idea sometimes when we talk in Ireland, about, dew on the ground, like something is dropping slow. And perhaps I'd invite you to think about, in terms of knowledge and thinking and imagination, to think about the capacity to allow experience and ideas to drop slow within us. And I'd like to encourage this, of course, being an Irish person. I'd like to encourage this and get you to think about this. It's very well articulated by W.B. Yeats. He's one of my favorite poets. And he describes this process of accessing deep knowledge in his poem. And it's called A Prayer for Old Age. God, guard me from those thoughts men think in the mind alone. He that sings a lasting song thinks in a marrow bone. So I'm saying that these insights can be forged through and rinsed through the marrow bone, with a good teacher as a container for the ambivalent strivings in the training institute and university, a supervisor who challenges, and a person analyst or therapist who realizes that training analysis is a misnomer and that we are creating touchstones for the truth of a person's identity for life. So I will move on, and I would like to end here, just to conclude. I would like to say that psychotherapy is not just an event in history or an interesting way of explaining the world with its drives, forces, defenses, and compromises. Psychotherapy is basically an encounter with what moves people and what constitutes the truth of desire. The discipline, profession, and work of psychotherapy can also act as a conduit and restorative act that enlivens discourse, questions certainties and events. In this way, psychotherapy is both a hermeneutic, interpretive, and subjective discipline. But ultimately, in people's lives and the people who come to see us, psychotherapy is about meaning making meaning of the subjective reality of someone living their lives. In cultures and individual lives, there is a time when words want to get themselves said. For that, you need a deep listening. Psychotherapy as a qualitative inquiry into the nature of being human is a valuable discipline to explore these complexities. For this, you need trainees that can critically evaluate what they're seeing, have the theoretical maps to embed the knowledge, and ultimately to have the soul of a warrior, to hold the fragility of a human soul in deep emotional distress. Thank you very much.